share my screen because I also have a PowerPoint presentation that'll assist us in walking you through this process. So let me just check if you can see that. Put it in presentation mode. Ooh. Wrong way around. Okay, does that look all right?
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, so yeah, as the speakers have made really clear, the US blockade is an extraterritorial application of sanctions. It's not just a bilateral issue between Cuba and the US, but it affects all of us. And several different campaigns have come together in Britain and Europe to devise a way of challenging these sanctions, okay? So the 1c4Cuba campaign was launched by a group of Cuba solidarity organizations in Britain and Europe, including Cuba Support Group Ireland, Rock Around the Blockade, and Cubanismo in Belgium. And we're also very keen for other organizations to take part and help develop this campaign internationally. Now, the experience that we found as solidarity organizations in Britain and Europe is that sometimes banks have either restricted accounts or rejected payments or delayed them because they have this suspicion that it might be transactions which have something to do with Cuba. As Helen explained really well, they consider this to be a kind of high-risk activity, and in some cases, they've blocked transactions, delayed them, and it's important to get across that this activity is illegal. Now, we consider the blockade in general to be illegal. It is against international law. It's a violation of Cuba's sovereignty and dignity, as Vijay was saying. But in Britain and Europe, we have a particular chance to an opportunity to challenge this. I think it was interesting to hear how from Helen that the US has applied the blockade whenever there's been a crisis. It's for Cuba, increased the sanctions and struck against Cuba in moments of weakness. Now, one thing about us, those of us who are outside the United States, and particularly in Britain and Europe, is that we can take advantage of the local laws, regulations, etc., which are supposed to prevent institutions like banks, etc., from complying with US sanctions against Cuba. Now, we had a sort of test phase through this campaign after we decided that we needed to do something about this. So we started to kind of like try and find out where are these sanctions applied? How is the sanctions applied extraterritorially? And what effect is it having on banking transactions in Britain and Europe? What we found is that simply sending a bank transaction to account in another country with the reference Cuba, even that can be enough to alert the internal review systems of banks. So they have electronic systems that monitor banking activity. And so they're required to check with the customer what the purpose of the transaction is, and they may delay or block the payment. So what we found is that some banks would actually reject international payments to third countries. Okay, so not even to the United States, not even to Cuba, I should say. But actually, if you send a bank transaction between two different European countries, the bank could block it if it thinks that it's going to be used in some way to assist Cuba. I'll think about the effect that this has on fundraising and material aid, or even educational political work in Britain and Europe to support Cuba. It's, preventing institutions from exchanging with each other, sending money to each other, fundraising, etc. But also the purpose of this campaign is to attack the blockade at point, in the jurisdictions where there are supposed to be blocking regulations. And so that's why it's open to customer complaints and legal challenges to challenge the bank's behavior. So how does it actually work? What we want is for it to be a collective action. This is how you can tell your bank to unblock Cuba. So essentially, we want to mobilize a lot of people, as many people as possible, to send small transactions, and it can be as little as 1 euro cent or 1 pence from UK or European bank accounts using reference words and destinations that are likely to trigger the bank's sanctions mechanisms against Cuba. And each small transaction and then the complaints process that you can follow will create a burden of costly administrative work for the bank at minimal cost to the customer. What we aim for is for multiple coordinated transactions which have the potential to create an unmanageable quantity of work and so make the US blockade of Cuba too costly or too risky to enforce. So I'll just go through quickly the actual process that you can follow as a bank customer. All you need is a European or UK bank account, and your balance shouldn't be zero, and then follow this process. So step one, you send an instruction to your bank, probably through online banking is easiest, but you could do it by telephone banking or in person. Make an international payment of 1 cent or 1 pence using the reference Cuba in the payment reference. Now, where do you send it to? So there's 3 destination accounts that we're using for this campaign so far. More may be included if other organizations want to participate in their countries. We encourage them to do that. So what we've found is we've sent test transactions to Medicuba Europa in Switzerland, which is an organization that raises medical aid to send to Cuba. We've also set up a destination bank account in Britain called 1c4C and Globalized Solidarity in Belgium. Just to note, so you need to send a transaction internationally. So it should be sent, if you're in Britain, you can send it abroad to Medicuba Europa, for example, or if you're in Europe, you could send it to, well, you can send it to Medicuba Europa if you're outside of Switzerland. One thing to note here is that Medicuba Europa is outside the European Economic Area, and some banks try to charge you for sending money there. So if you don't want to do that, you could send it to, for example, Globalized Solidarity or 1c4C in Britain. Right. Now, if you do this, this was my experience, you may immediately get a call from your bank. So my bank called me up and said, listen, we see that you're trying to send an international payment. Does it have anything to do with Cuba or the United States? At this point, you know, you can say what you want, but the main point is that we're not supposed to hide the fact that this is about Cuba. You can simply say that the organization you're sending it to, you understand that they're supporting Cuba by raising money for medical aid, something like that, and that's something you want to support. And that's your right as a customer to do that. You can ask for a recording of the telephone conversation or an email. Ask for something in writing, because again, well, apart from having evidence for yourself, it creates further burden on the bank. Now, if your payment looks like it went through, so you've sent your 1 cent or 1 pence to another account, it looks like it's left your account, you should receive some kind of remittance advice or payment confirmation. If you do, that's normal with international transactions. If it looks like you have, then try again. So you can take this further by sending more payments. You can schedule 10 payments of 1 pence over several days, which is something that I did, or try a different bank account destination. Or if you have multiple bank accounts, you could try a different bank. And of course, encourage friends and comrades to do the same thing. Now, if either the bank rejects the payment or you're waiting for 5 days and nothing has happened, then it's time to start a complaints process. Now, if the bank does reject your payment, firstly, I mean, you should include that in your complaint, but if they do reject it, they might call you up and explain this. When I got a call from my bank, they said it was outside of their risk appetite to accept payments to Medicuba Europa. Okay, so this is exactly what Helen was talking about in terms of these are risk-averse institutions, and if they think that it has anything to do with the blockade, they're trying to avoid fines from OFAC. So you may get that kind of communication. Ask for it in writing. It's very important. You can even, I mean, preferably ask them for a letter to your address, because they have to print it off and put it in the post. So you should complain to the bank if it if the payment has been rejected or even delayed by 5 days. Find the address for complaints on their website. Now, we've provided template letters of complaint. So this is, again, in order to make this as simple and easy as possible for the customers and as difficult for the banks, on the 1c4Cuba website, which Nina is going to take us through in a minute. We've got a set of resources, including template letters that you can use. You can simply delete the parts which don't apply to your jurisdiction and send it off to the bank and ask them for a reply within 5 working days. Now, if they reply, regardless of the reasons that they provide, if they've rejected the payment or if they still haven't replied, there's a second letter of complaint that we provided. You don't have to be a legal expert because these letters include all of the relevant legislation. So in Europe, there are blocking legislation that was brought in from 1996, which specifically, it not only threatens banks and institutions with sanctions if they comply with the blockade, but it actually protects them against litigation. And yet this blocking legislation is not being enforced. So you can refer to this in your complaints process. Now, this might be sufficient, and if the bank apologizes or said they made a mistake, ask them to put it in writing. Ask them for compensation. If they don't offer you it, then ask for it. When my bank blocked my payment, they then apologized. They offered more than £90 compensation. So there you go. And then demand that they approve the original payment, or if they tell you to make it again, then start the process again, see if it works. And there's another template letter you can use for that purpose. If you are offered compensation, we encourage you to accept this, donate it to the local campaign in your country, or a legitimate fund for material aid for Cuba. So that would be Rock Around the Blockade here in Britain, is the participating campaign in 1c4Cuba. And then finally, so this process of complaints and submitting these transactions, we hope that this is going to be sufficient to create risk and create pressure on the banks to relent in their sanctions policies. But whether or not the bank continues to reject your transactions, we ask you to participate in the campaign and submit information about your complaints process to our central campaign email, which you'll find on the website. And we can use this information to help coordinate legal challenges. So, for example, in Britain, the bank is required to contact you after you've submitted a complaint and give you a final statement about it and give you advice on how you can complain to the financial regulators and what the time limit is. So that will be the next step in the process. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. If there are any questions about this process, I'll be happy to answer them after Nina's taken us through the 1c4Cuba website.